Over the past few years, more and more people are beginning to discover the capability, value, and of course, fun of the hardcore hardtail. And brands have taken notice. There are more of these aggressive hardtail bikes on the market today than ever before. And a couple months ago, I actually did a video looking at the top 10 hardcore hardtails that you could buy in 2023, but there are just too many good bikes to stop the list at 10. So I've got another list here for you, but this one's a little different because every one of these 10 bikes in today's list has been chosen by one of you. That's right, I went through the comments from that first video and I took your suggestions and I'm adding them to this video here. And to keep things fun, I'm gonna go ahead and rank those bikes in order from the bike that I'd be least likely to purchase all the way up to the bike that I would be most likely to purchase. And here's a hint, I already purchased it. But before we get into that list, I wanna real quick cover the criteria that I'm gonna use when ranking these bikes, just so you guys can get on the same page with me. If you saw that first top 10 video I did, which by the way, if you haven't, I've got it linked down there in the description, you already know that the first thing that I look for when deciding on a new bike is the frame quality and the frame geometry. Now, in terms of geometry, I like my hardcore hardtails to have a bit of fun in there as well, so I'm not looking for the most slack, aggressive bike out there. I tend to like things like short chainstays, a short seat tube, a higher bottom bracket, just makes the bike feel poppier, and then a moderate head tube angle, around 64 or 65 degrees. The reason that I place frame quality and geometry above anything else is that it's probably the hardest and one of the most expensive parts to replace along the road. Now, speaking of parts, that's the second thing that I look at when choosing these top 10 bikes. You're not gonna see any bikes, at least at the top of my list, that don't have a decent drivetrain, some tubeless ready rims and tires, and parts on there that you can at least take out and get on a decent trail ride. That said, you're not gonna see a lot of high-end baller builds at the top of my list either, because I think some of those real high-end parts, you don't really get the value out of them. Sure, they might be a touch better, but maybe not that whole $500 better. And lastly, before I start my list, keep in mind that this is, well, my list. All these bikes on here are good, but I've gone ahead and chosen which ones are best for me. And the bike that I rank as number one might not be a great bike for you to purchase. Likewise, some of the lower ranking bikes might be perfect for you. So make sure before you go out and purchase your own hardcore hardtail that you dive into the geometry, maybe take some test rides and find a bike that's gonna fit your riding style, your terrain, and gonna be your perfect bike, not mine. So with that out of the way, let's get started with bike number 10, way down at the bottom of the list, and that is the Orange Crush. The Orange Crush is a bike that I've honestly always wanted to love. Orange is a super cool brand from the UK that's kind of just going their own way with bikes. They make a lot of single pivot full suspension bikes as well as some really cool hardcore hardtails. And the Orange Crush frame is super rad. Sadly, however, the part spec that comes with this bike is pretty lousy for the money you gotta spend for it. And that's really the only reason why it's coming in at the bottom of my list at number 10. And we'll talk more about that part spec in just a little bit, but let's start by focusing on the super rad things about the Orange Crush. First and foremost is that it's available as a 27.5 frame and build, a 29-inch frame and build, and then a mullet build on that 27.5-inch frame. It's getting less and less common for brands to make 27.5-inch hardcore hardtails, and you guys know I like the small wheels, so I'm pretty stoked that Orange still does that. Speaking of those smaller wheels, the Orange Crush that I've chosen to include in this list is the Orange Crush Comp, which does roll on 27.5-inch wheels and will set you back $2,800. If you wanted to spend a little more than that, you could get the Orange Crush Pro for $3,200 or the base level for $2,600. The geometry on the Orange Crush is a bit of a mixed bag for me. It's got a 150mm fork, which I think is just about perfect, paired with a 63.5 degree head tube angle, which is slacker than I like, but I know a lot of riders who are into that, and that's great. The size large has a reach of 480mm and a stack height of 645, which is on the bigger side, but definitely in line with what most brands are doing these days. The 430mm chainstays are just about average as well, and probably the thing that annoys me the most is that it's got a 458mm tall seat tube. In my opinion, most bikes these days are getting down to 440 and under, and really there's no reason to have a big old tall seat tube on an aggressive hardtail that's meant to be ridden like this bike is. Now, most of the part spec that comes on this bike isn't bad. You're getting nice tubeless Maxxis tires, you're getting a dropper post, a Shimano Dior drivetrain, which works great, but at $2,800, that's pretty steep for those level components. As you'll see later, there's bikes on this list costing almost $1,000 less with the same components. The one thing that really turns me off about this bike though is its fork. It comes with the RockShox 35 Silver, and the website doesn't specify whether that's coming with the air sprung version or the coil sprung version, but regardless, having a bike that's oftentimes spec'd on hardtails that cost, I don't know, $1,000 on this $2,800 bike is just a non-starter for me, and that's the reason I put it down here at number 10. Now, that said, if you're just interested in the frame or you're just loaded with money and you can replace all those parts when you want to anyway, then yeah, this is a great bike, but I just can't really recommend it too strongly because of that price point and the parts that are spec'd on it. The next bike on my list has a surprisingly large amount of devout fans, and that's the Giant Fathom 1. I've had dozens of people reach out to me telling me about this bike and asking me to do a review and asking me if I'd heard of it, and to me, it leans a little bit more towards the XC side of things than I tend to prefer, which is why it's down here at number 9 on the list, but it does represent a decent value, and probably the best thing about it is that it's going to be really easy for you to go and get at your local bike shop. There's a Giant dealer in just about every town, and they're a well-respected brand, so you shouldn't have any issues with warranty or if things are to break or anything like that if you went with this option. The model that I've chosen for this list is the Fathom 1, which is just $1,850 and has pretty much everything you need to go out and enjoy some decent kind of XC riding or trail riding. It's a pretty versatile bike, but it might not be the one you want to take to the bike park or do some enduro racing on. If the $1,800 price tag on this Giant Fathom 1 is a bit too steep for you, Giant also sells this for $1,500 with the Fathom 2 model, which again represents really good value. Like I said a second ago, Giant is a huge brand and they manufacture actually a lot of frames for other people, so it should be no surprise that this Fathom 1 frame is dialed. I mentioned earlier that this bike feels a little more XC for me, and that's because of the 66-degree head tube angle and very tall 465mm seat post. However, the 130 millimeters of travel and the 27.5-inch plus tires are going to make this still a very capable trail bike if you want to do some longer days in the saddle or ride some more Black Diamond trails. The bike has a very average reach of 470 millimeters, a stack height of 631 millimeters, and a chainstay length of 435 millimeters. The bottom bracket drop is pretty significant for a 27.5-inch bike, dropping that down 60 millimeters, which in my experience is going to make pedal strikes very prevalent, especially on that 27.5-inch wheel, as well as make it a little bit harder to get that front wheel up off the ground. That said, it's going to keep the bike feeling a lot more stable at high speeds, and I think that Giant's definitely designed this bike more around beginners, so they're probably going to be more focused on, again, staying stable and less about trying to do bunny hops and manuals. Moving on to the part spec, like most of Giant's kind of lower level, entry level bikes, they actually have their own in-house fork that they have, and that's the Giant Crest 34 RCL. I've never ridden this fork, and at first I was a little turned off that it wasn't, a Fox or a RockShox or a DVO or a brand that we're more familiar with, but after doing a little bit of research on it, seems like people are saying pretty good stuff about the Giant forks. I would recommend this bike for a beginner who's maybe getting their first hardtail mountain bike because the geometry is very well rounded, the part spec is decent, and again, probably the best thing about this bike, or the thing that adds the most value, is that Giant is a very well reputed brand with lots of local bike shops that will help you take care of your bike. You don't have to worry about getting it shipped to you and building it up, so a great first mountain bike. Coming in at number 8, we have another very, very popular bike with a very vocal following, and that is the Trek Roscoe. I probably had more people calling me out on not including the Roscoe on the last video I did than just about any other bike on this list. And for good reason. It's a great bike, and just like the Giant I talked about before, Trek has a great rapport, a lot of local bike shops, so it's going to be easy to find one, and then easy to find somebody who knows how to work on it if you don't like doing your own maintenance. Sadly, however, I feel like the frame geometry doesn't fit at least my riding style very well, and the part spec for value is not great. Let's go ahead and start off though with that geometry. The bike rolls on 29-inch wheels with a 140mm fork and a 65-degree head tube angle. It has a reach of 470mm and a stack height of 644mm. All this is great, but there's a few numbers here that start to get a little weary if you ask me. First up is the seat tube. It's 450mm tall, which is a bit on the tall side, but the thing that bothers me most about it is that it actually has a water bottle cage mounted to that seat tube, which makes it so you can't run as long of a travel dropper post. Another thing I don't love about this bike is the bottom bracket drop. It drops down to 60mm, which is going to make it, like I said earlier, a little harder to get that front wheel off the ground. Keep in mind though that those geo things that I view as a weakness or something that I don't like about this bike could be great for others. The second water bottle cage makes it so you can go on super long backcountry rides and store all your water on the frame, which is awesome. The lower bottom bracket is going to keep this bike nice and stable at high speeds, just like the Giant I talked about earlier, which if you're looking to race this thing, it's going to be super important for you. Moving on then to the part spec. The Roscoe that I've included for this list, the one that I think represents the best value for you guys, is the Roscoe 8, which usually lists for $2,399, but is actually on sale right now for just $19.99. Trek makes a whole slew of these bikes starting down in the Trek Roscoe 6, which is just going to set you back $1,200, all the way up to the Roscoe 9, which is $2,800. They also sell it as a frame for $750, so if you like the geometry on this bike, then that frame is actually not a bad deal. Like I said earlier, this has a 140mm fork, and that's brought to you by the RockShox 35 Gold. That's an air-sprung fork. It's essentially like a Lyric or a Pike, just without all the sophistication that those other forks have. The drivetrain on this thing is a mixed bag of SRAM NX and GX, which should all work pretty well for you, as well as some 4-piston Shimano brakes that I don't think anyone will have any complaints with. The bike also comes with Bontrager XR4 tires, which I absolutely love. It's what I have on my RSD middle child. I've actually done a full review of them that you can check out here. So I think if you buy this bike as kind of an all-around trail bike, those tires are going to work perfect for you. And well, $2,400, the list price for this might be a little steep, especially with that low-end fork that's spec'd on it. If you can pick this thing up right now for just $19.99, I actually think that's a pretty good deal. Again, especially if you're looking to use this bike as maybe like a long day out in the woods or an enduro racer, I think this could be perfect for you. But some of the geo doesn't quite line up if you're interested in a playful jibby hardtail like I like to ride. Speaking of long days out in the woods, this next bike comes from a brand that's essentially dedicated themselves to that, taking your bike on backpacking trips and big adventures. And that is of course Salsa. And the bike that comes in at number 7 is the Salsa Timberjack. The Timberjack is sold in 3 different build options, as well as the frame only, and even a titanium frame. So if you want to go big and get yourself a Thai Timberjack, there's an option for it. I also like that it's spec'd with either 27.5 plus or 29-inch wheels, so there's a lot of options for you out there. But the build that I've chosen to talk about in today's list is the 27.5-inch XT version, which will set you back $2,549 US. I said at the beginning of this video that I think the thing you should be paying most attention to when you're buying a new bike is the frame. And this Timberjack frame is super cool. For starters, I love the look of it, but it's also got some really cool features like these interchangeable dropouts that make it super versatile. It essentially allows you to run the bike as 27.5, 29, single speed, geared, all by changing those rear dropouts. Similar to the Giant Fathom, this bike comes with a 130mm fork and a pretty steep, at least comparatively, head-tube angle of 66.4 degrees. That definitely pushes it closer to the cross-country side of the spectrum, but it's also got just a 432mm seat tube, which should still make it very maneuverable underneath you, so it could make a great kind of dirt jumpy bike that you also wanted to do some XC races on. Maybe a playful XC bike, you could call it. Like the Roscoe, the Timberjack does have a seat tube mounted bottle cage, but it's very low down in that seat tube, so I don't think you're going to run into those same clearance issues like you would with the Roscoe, so I'm not super worried about it. And speaking of mounting bolts, this bike is pretty much covered with them. I mentioned earlier that Salsa does a lot with bike packing, and you can definitely see that influence on this bike. It's got mounting bolts on the top tube, on the seat tube, on the top side of the down tube, and on the bottom side of the down tube. So you can load this thing up with all the gear you want and take it on epic trips in the woods. And if that's what you want to do, this is the bike for you. I mentioned earlier that this frame also has interchangeable dropouts, allowing you to change the chainstay length from 420mm up to 437mm. That paired with a bottom bracket drop of 56mm should make this bike feel pretty lively as long as you don't have it loaded down with all your gear for the weekend. Everything else on this bike, the reach, the stack, the seat tube angle, is all just about average. You can look that up online if you want to, but we're gonna go ahead and skip right now to the part spec and talk about why I placed this bike at number 7 on my list. Starting up front, the Timberjack XT has a 130mm RockShox 35 Gold fork. We've seen this on a few bikes today, so I'm not going to talk much more about it, and I'm going to go ahead and skip down to the drivetrain, which, as you've guessed, does have a good bit of Shimano XT stuff in there, which is super high-end, and it's great to see that on a bike that's just over $2,500. It also comes with 4-piston Shimano brakes, full Shimano wheels, and Maxxis Minion tires front and back. Really, I don't think there's much that you would need to change on this thing with the exception of maybe that fork to take this thing out on some multi-day backpacking trips or even out to the dirt jumps. It's a pretty versatile bike. I'd recommend the Timberjack XT for someone who really seeks out the adventurous side of mountain biking. They want a bike that can basically go anywhere they want to and isn't going to be too hard to get them there. I do think you're going to start to see the limitations of that steeper head tube angle and 130mm fork if you start taking it on really gnarly runs, but other than that, this thing should be able to take just about whatever you throw at it. Coming in at number 6 is a legend of a hardtail. It's the Santa Cruz Chameleon. This thing has been around for decades, and the name Chameleon literally refers to the fact that it can kind of do a little bit of everything, and that's definitely true of this latest model. Santa Cruz offers it in 3 different build options, as well as with a MX setup or a mixed wheel mullet setup and a full 29-inch setup. The bike that I've chosen to include in the list today is the Chameleon MXR, which again is mixed wheel and in the middle of the range, and it will set you back $3,199, but it is on sale right now for $25.99, which is actually a pretty dang good deal. The aluminum frame on the Chameleon is one of the cleanest on this list. The welds are super nice, there's no big obvious gussets, it's got really clean dropouts, it's a beautiful looking frame. It's also got some pretty dang good geometry to go with it. It does run a 130mm fork, but with a 65-degree head tube angle. But I've known riders who have bumped this up to 140 or even 150 to make it a little more aggressive, and it's handled it just fine. The seat tube is nice and low at just 430mm. The reach is on the shorter side at 465mm in the size large. The stack is 638mm. Just like the Timberjack we just talked about, the Chameleon has a really cool dropout system where you can interchange them to change the chainstay length as well as run it geared or single speed. Those trick dropouts allow you to change the chainstay length from a short, snappy 425mm all the way up to 437mm. But let's go ahead and move on to the part spec, because sadly that's the thing on this bike that prevented it from being higher up on my list. The middle tier build that I chose for the list retails at $3,199. The Chameleon RMX comes with a Fox 34 with 130mm of travel. It's also got a SRAM NX drivetrain, which is on the heavier side but still works just fine, and some SRAM Guide T brakes. Raceface takes care of the rims and hubs on this guy, and those wheels are wrapped with some Maxxis tires. You're gonna get a DHF in the front and an Aggressor in the back. Once again, a very versatile tire, speaking to the intended purpose of this bike. And while all those parts are great, the fact that it's gonna cost you over $3,000 makes this bike a bit spendy in my book. That said, it's currently $600 off, so if you wanna get a Chameleon, now is the best time to do it, and I will say that for $2,600, that's actually not a bad deal, but looking at the bike for $3,200, yeah, I wouldn't say that part spec really cuts it. So who is the Chameleon for? Again, like the name suggests, I think it's for somebody who wants to do everything on their bike. They want to race XC, they want to go to the bike park, they want to do some dirt jumping or maybe jib around at a skate park. This bike and the adjustability that comes with it is going to make it a great option for that rider. We are halfway through the list. We've got our bottom 5 bikes done and we've got my top 5 to come. And I just wanted to pause right here and say that if you are liking this video, please think about going down there, hitting the like button and hitting the subscribe button. That's gonna help this channel grow and help more people find this video. But with that out of the way, let's hop in to bike number 5. Bike number 4 on my list is another one that I heard tons of comments about on my last video, and that is the Canyon Stoic. This bike has been out now for 3 or 4 years, and I actually just found out, I think, that Canyon is coming out with an updated model. Now, the only websites that I've been able to find that are saying anything about this are in German, which is where Canyon is from, and it doesn't seem like it's hit the US media just yet, but I'm sure you're gonna see that announced in the near future, and I'll probably do a video on it. For now though, we're gonna stick with the older models. Those are the ones that are still offered on the Canyon website here in the US. And the bike that I'm gonna focus on today is the Canyon Stoic 4, which is just $1,999. Now, if $2,000 still seems a bit steep for you for a hardtail, Canyon also makes the Stoic 2, which is just $1,200. And for that, you'll get the same nice frame, but without all those fancy bits and pieces bolted onto it. Similar to the Chameleon I just talked about, the Stoic has a beautiful aluminum frame. But this frame doesn't just look good. Canyon's done a lot of cool stuff to make this frame great for all sorts of different riders. For one, it comes with size-specific wheels. So if you're a smaller rider getting a smaller medium frame, you'll get 27.5-inch wheels, whereas the rest of us will be getting 29-inch wheels. It's also got size-specific chainstays, meaning that the back end of the bike will get proportionally shorter or longer as the front end of the bike shrinks and grows. The Stoic 4 has a very well-rounded 140mm fork with a 65-degree head tube angle. The size large has a reach of 480mm, which is a bit on the longer side, and a stack height of 635mm. The chainstays are nice and short at 428mm, which should make it feel nice and poppy, easy to corner, easy to maneuver, but the lower bottom bracket, 60mm of bottom bracket drop, will make it a bit harder to pull that front end up and do manuals and wheelies. And as good as that frame is, it's the spec on this thing that really makes the Canyon Stoic shine. This is the first bike on our list that I would say has come with a super solid fork that you don't ever really need to worry about replacing until it breaks, which again, I don't picture that happening. It's gonna come with the RockShox Lyric Select. Interestingly, it's also got the same SRAM NX drivetrain and Guide T brakes that we just saw on the Chameleon, but this bike costs an entire $1,000 less than the Chameleon does. Again, speaking to the value of this Canyon Stoic. The rest of the spec seems pretty solid as well, so I really don't think you're gonna need to worry about replacing anything at least too soon on this bike, and that's really saying something for a bike that costs under $2,000. Honestly, the deal breaker on this bike for me though is the seat tube. It's 460mm long, and as I've talked about in many videos, including this one already, I don't think there's any reason for hardtails to have those super tall seat tubes, as it limits people from being able to size up, as well as to get the seat super low and out of the way if you're doing, say, inverts or fast plants or things where you want just as much standover height as you can get. So who's the Canyon Stoic for? Honestly, anybody. It's a great bike. Like I've said about a lot of these bikes, it's going to be capable at a lot of different things, but I will say the Stoic probably leans a little bit more towards the aggressive side of things. So you want a bike that you can race an enduro on or maybe take to the bike park, I think the Stoic's a great option for you. But keep in mind, it does have that taller seat tube, so if you're someone like me who maybe is used to riding a BMX bike with that seat super out of the way, this might not be the best option for you. The next bike on my list always puts a smile on my face, and that is the On One Hello Dave. I mean, just look at the name, the On One Hello Dave. You can't not smile. But the same thing goes when you start looking at the frame, the kind of crazy geometry it has, but especially the super, super great part spec that you get for the cost. Let's go ahead and start with that frame though. The Hello Dave is a 29-inch steel frame with a 150mm fork and a super slack 62-degree head tube angle. Now, in my opinion, that's slacker than a hardtail really needs to be, but it could make for a fun little shred bike if it maybe was your second bike and you had something a little bit more practical to ride around most of the time. You guys know I like short seat tubes, and the Hello Dave fits that category with just a 430mm seat tube. What's not short, however, are the chainstays on this bike. They are 458mm long, which is honestly absurd. Not many downhill bikes have 458mm chainstays these days, so that definitely makes this bike super unique. So with that 62-degree head tube angle, the longish reach of 480mm, and the absurdly long chainstays, this is definitely not going to be a fun, playful, jibby hardtail. This is about as close as you can get to a downhill bike without any rear travel these days, and for that reason, I think this bike is just super fun. I will say, however, that information on One bikes is a little bit spotty. They don't even have a website up and running right now, so maybe be careful before you push this thing too hard, because I just don't know too much about the company or the brand, which is why it's not, number 1 or 2 on my list. But that's enough about the frame. Let's go ahead and move on to the part spec, because that's really what sets this bike apart. I've gone ahead and chosen the Hello Dave GX build for this video, and that retails at $2,050. But On One also sells this with full SRAM axis, that's an axis drivetrain, as well as axis dropper post, for just $2,900. And the fact that you can get an axis-equipped steel hardtail for under $3,000 is absurd. But let's just stick with the GX build for now. As the name would imply, this thing comes with a full SRAM GX drivetrain. It's actually the only bike on today's list to do that. I'm a huge fan of SRAM GX, so that's pretty cool. It's also got some SRAM Guide G2 brakes, which should hopefully be enough to slow that bike down, but I don't know. That thing looks like it's meant to just rip super fast in a straight line. It's also got a RockShox Pike Select fork up front. I'm a little surprised that they did not spec this bike with a RockShox Lyric. Again, that seems a little bit more fitting for a bike with a 62-degree head tube angle. So who is this crazy bike with an even crazier value for? Honestly, I don't think it really should be anyone's only bike unless you're only doing shuttle riding on again, straight, steep trails. That 62-degree head tube angle and the really long chainstays is going to make it hard to maneuver, and it'll make it not very fun on flowier trails, let alone taking it to a skate park or dirt jumps. But if you already have more of an all-around bike and you want just a straight-up shredder that you can try to keep up with your buddies on full-on downhill bikes with, I can't think of a better bike than the On1 Hello Dave. We are getting very close to the top of my list, and coming in at number 2 is another bike that I heard from a lot of you guys asking me, why is this not on your list of top 10 hardtails? And that is the Kona Honza ESD. Just like the Santa Cruz Chameleon I talked about before, the Kona Honza has been around for decades and is a legendary bike, and this latest model, the ESD, is one of the coolest yet. It's got a steel frame rolling on 29-inch tires, and it's only available in one build option, which will set you back $3,099. You can also get the ESD as a frame-only option, which will set you back $699, which honestly I think is a pretty dang good deal for a beautiful steel frame. It's super well built with some pretty dialed geometry that we're gonna get into right now. The ESD has a slack 63-degree head tube angle with a 150mm fork. The size large has a reach of 490mm, which is longer than any bike on today's list. What's not so long, however, are the chainstays, which are tucked in at just 417mm. It's honestly crazy for me that they can fit a 29-inch wheel with those super short chainstays. I'm sure one of the things that makes that possible is the seat tube angle, which is pretty dang steep at 77.5 degrees, but that should actually pair nicely with that longer reach, making sure that you don't feel too stretched out when you're doing any seated pedaling. So while those chainstays should serve to make this be a really playful 29er, it's also got a really low bottom bracket, dropping it down 62.5mm. While I haven't personally ridden this bike before, I'm guessing that that low bottom bracket and super short chainstay will kind of balance each other out, making it not the most stable and planted bike, but also not the most poppy and playful either. Moving on to parts, the Honza has a very fitting Marzocchi Z1 bomber fork and 150mm. I think those 36mm stanchions really speak to the intentions of this hardcore steel frame. This bike should definitely rip. The drivetrain is going to come from Shimano with an SLX and XT mix, and the brakes are also going to come from Shimano with some 4-piston Shimano brakes bolted to a massive 203mm up front and 180mm rotor in the rear. Hubs are also covered by Shimano in the form of the SLX hubs, which should be super dialed, laced to some race face rims. Those wheels are wrapped with Maxxis tires. You'll get an Assegai up front and a DH2 in the back, again speaking to the fact that this bike is designed to go fast downhill. And so while the part spec, frame geometry, and frame quality is all super great on the Honza ESD, I do feel like the $3,099 price point is just a little steep. That said, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend this bike to anybody who's wanting a 29-inch aggressive hardtail that is really going to be a solid enduro ripper, but also some cool geometry features like that short C-tube and the short chainstays that should still keep it feeling pretty fun on less aggressive trails, or should you choose to take it to a pump track, some dirt jumps, or a skate park. I'd also add that I think the frame value on this thing far exceeds the complete. The fact that you can get this frame for just $700 is super rad, and if you're savvy and you don't mind going and getting used parts, you might be able to build that frame up for less than $3,000. Well, we've made it. It's the moment you have all been waiting for. We are down to my number 1 bike that you guys suggested to me on this last video, and this bike is interesting for a lot of reasons. First of all, this bike kind of was in my last video, except it was just the older generation. You see, the 2023 version of this bike came out literally days after I posted that video, and after learning about that bike, I actually went ahead and bought it, and it's sitting right here behind me. It's the 2023 Marin San Quentin 3. If you've been following along on this channel, you know I've already done several videos on this bike, so I'm going to keep this brief here, and I'll post some links down in the description if you want to learn more about this beautiful bike that I have behind me. To be honest, the largest selling point for me on this bike was the super short C-tube. The size large has a C-tube of just 375mm, which is absurd. That's like what most smalls or even extra smalls have. I actually ended up going with an extra large for that reason. The C-tube on the XL is still just 414mm, making it shorter than any of the other larges on this list, which allowed me to upsize and get the benefit of the stability that comes with that longer reach, and still keep that seat out of the way so I can get super low on the bike. The rest of the geometry on this bike is all relatively average. It's got 425mm chain stays, it's got a 470mm reach, but it does have a pretty low bottom bracket, especially for being a 27.5-inch bike. The bottom bracket drop is 50mm, and that definitely makes it noticeably harder to get that front end up, to do tricks like bunny hops and manuals. It's not gonna be as easy as it would be on, say, the Chameleon with the higher bottom bracket. The San Quentin 3 also has a pretty steep seat tube at 77 degrees. So if you don't size up, you might find that the seated climbing position is just a little bit cramped. So moving on to the part spec. This thing has a 140mm Marzocchi Bomber Z2 fork. Drivetrain and braking is both taken care of Shimano with a 12-speed Dior drivetrain and some 4-piston Shimano brakes. Rims and hubs come in-house from Marin, and for tires, you're gonna get Maxxis Assegais front and back. I personally think that that's a little more tire than this bike really needs. Marin does market this bike as kind of being like an enduro dirt jump hybrid, and I will say that those Assegais feel pretty slow on anything other than super steep, chunky stuff. So there's the geo and the part spec. Let's talk about why I placed this bike at number 1. Well, for starters, it's a great value. It's under $2,000, and really there's nothing that you would need to change about this bike to take it out there and use on just about all of your rides. Another reason why I placed this bike at the top of the list is that Marin is getting more and more common in local bike shops. That means that if you wanted to go and buy this bike as your first bike and you didn't have the know-how or the tools to assemble it and work on it yourself, you're gonna have a team of professional bike mechanics who can help you out whenever you need. And I think that's super important, especially again when we're talking about new riders getting into the sport. So who is this bike for? Based on my limited experience with it, I will say that the San Quentin leans a little bit closer to the enduro side than it does the dirt jump side. So I would say it's gonna be for a similar audience as that Kona Honza ESD, for someone who wants to do more enduro, downhill type riding, but also wants to have a bike that's gonna feel playful as well. But the San Quentin is over $1,000 less than that Kona, making it a really, really good value. So if you're on the market for a first mountain bike or a first hardtail and you want it to rip, I can't think of a better bike for you than the San Quentin 3. And that's it. 10 more mountain bikes that you suggested to me, and now I'm somehow suggesting back to you that you should maybe think about buying in 2023. Let me know in the comments which bikes I missed. Maybe I'll make another top 10 bikes that you should buy this year, as well as if you disagree with the way that I ranked some of these bikes. If you have any personal experience riding these, let me know as well, because I've only ridden a handful of bikes on this list. Speaking of bikes that you ride, I actually need your guys' help with a future video that I'm working on. If you're familiar with Donut Media, they make some videos where they take subscribers' cars and kind of rank them, and I think that'd be a fun thing to do with your guys' bikes. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in, I've actually got my email down there in the description, so you can send me a few pictures of your bike, what parts you're running, the frame geo, all that good stuff, and I'll go ahead and make a fun little video ranking your bikes and sharing my thoughts on the bikes that you guys actually ride. Lastly, if you haven't done so already, if you would please like this video and subscribe to the channel. That would mean a lot to Wendy and I, and then you know what to do. Grab your bike, whether it was on this list or not, head out for a ride, and hopefully we'll see you out there.